The snow had fallen without pause for 3 days. The cabin at the forest's edge, long abandoned, was nearly swallowed by white. No footprints. No smoke. No signs of life. And yet, she stood there. Wrapped in a worn green coat, scarf trailing in the wind, her breath shallow and fogged. Her eyes scanned the trees as though she heard something only she could. A shift. A thump. A presence. And then, from the tree line, a shape emerged. Massive, silent, slow. Its thick coat dusted in snowflakes. A scar across its left shoulder. The same limp. The same eyes. She dropped to her knees. Tears came instantly, but her lips moved slowly. You came back. The bear stopped. Then, without sound or command, lay down beside her. And for the first time in years, she closed her eyes and exhaled. It had been exactly 4 winters since she'd last seen him. Emily had never told anyone about the bear. Not fully. Not the way it actually was. People knew she worked with wildlife rehabilitation for a time, that she'd lived near the forest, studied animal behavior, once raised a cub for release. But no one really knew. Not what that cub had meant. Not what losing him had done. She hadn't meant to keep him. In fact, the plan was always to release him. He was barely 3 weeks old when she'd found him, fur soaked in blood, limp beside his mother's collapsed body near the highway. A hit and run. Most cubs wouldn't survive the night. This one had. She named him Milo. Not because he needed a name, but because she did. The first winter, Milo slept beside a warm stove. She fed him formula with rubber gloves and sat for hours watching him crawl across the wood floors of her off-grid cabin. By spring, he was waddling after her into the woods. By summer, she stopped locking the cabin door. And then, by the second winter, she knew it was time. His instincts were kicking in. He'd begun to wander farther, explore on his own, sleep outside rather than curled beside her. When the state biologists approved his release, she agreed. Not because she wanted to, but because it was right. Bears were meant to be wild. The last morning she saw him, he had returned to the porch, sat in front of her like always. She opened the door. He sniffed her hand. She whispered, "You'll be okay." Then, he walked into the trees. She didn't know it would be the last time. The next few months were quiet. Lonely, but proud. She'd done what she was trained to do. Release and let go. But then, one morning, she saw a news clip online. Large brown bear found near Ridgepoint Farms. Aggressive. Sedated for transport. Her gut turned over. The scar on its shoulder. The coloration. It looked just like Milo. She called, emailed, drove 3 hours to the regional office. But they had already tagged and relocated the bear. Deep into state forest lands. Untrackable. They wouldn't tell her where. No one believed it was the same bear. No one wanted to listen. So she quit. She sold the cabin. She disappeared. But every winter since, she returned. Just for a few days. Just in case. She'd stand by the tree line. Leave pieces of dried fruit. Sometimes the scarf he used to chew. And every time, nothing came. Until now. Emily didn't move right away. The snow had soaked into the knees of her jeans. The wind needled her skin. But nothing could pull her gaze from the bear now lying beside her like it had never left. His breathing was steady. Slow. So heavy that the snow on his back began to melt in patches from the warmth he carried. For minutes, she said nothing. She watched his chest rise, fall, the gentle flick of his ear as the wind shifted. His paws, massive now, dusted with frost and mud and time. She traced his shoulder with her eyes, the faint scar, barely visible beneath matted fur, but unmistakable. It was him. Her Milo. 4 winters gone, and still, he had found her. But how? She reached forward slowly, hand trembling. Every instinct told her not to touch him. He was wild now, fully grown, a force of nature. But when her fingertips brushed his fur, he didn't flinch. He exhaled, almost like a sigh. "Milo," she whispered. His eyes opened, just slightly. Deep brown, almost golden around the rim. The same eyes she used to see looking back from the corner of the cabin hearth, from under the chair, from behind the milk crate she once used as a feeding station. The same eyes that had blinked at her before disappearing into the trees. Her voice cracked. "You really did come back." The bear shifted his weight, nudged his head slightly toward her. Not a roar. Not a grunt. Just a movement, a soft lean, like he remembered her scent. She felt the burn behind her eyes before the tears even surfaced. The cabin behind her creaked in the wind. It had been years since anyone had touched it. The windows were boarded over now, not out of fear, but preservation. A small lock on the door, long rusted. The porch had collapsed in one corner. No power. No warmth. Just the shell of what had once been home. She hadn't expected to return. She only kept the deed because part of her couldn't let go. Maybe because part of her hoped this exact moment might happen. But hope had thinned with each passing winter. Until this one. She gently placed her palm flat against Milo's shoulder. And then, slowly, he pushed himself to standing. She held her breath. Was this it? Would he leave again? Instead, he turned and walked to the porch. Paused. Looked back. She stood, legs aching, and followed. Inside, the air was bitter with dust and time. She had to shoulder the door open. The hinges shrieked in protest, and a cloud of cold air spilled into the room. The smell of cedar, mold, and ash from long-dead fires hung in the walls. Milo hesitated, just outside the frame. He stared in, then down, then up at her. She stepped aside. He entered. The floorboards groaned under his weight, but held. She watched as he made a slow circle of the room, first to the hearth, then to the corner where the old food bin used to sit. Then finally to the chair she'd once rocked in, feeding him with gloved hands while he pawed at her sleeves. He lay down near the fire pit. Same spot. Same way. Emily couldn't speak. Her mouth was dry. Her hands tingled from cold and adrenaline. She dropped her backpack by the door and pulled the scarf from around her neck. The same one he used to tug on when he was restless as a cub. Its ends were frayed, patches chewed, but she had kept it all these years. She placed it gently beside him. He didn't touch it at first. But then, without sound, he laid his paw across it. Just like before. That night, she didn't build a fire. There was no need. She simply sat beside him on the floor, blanket around her shoulders, and watched the snow pile outside the cracks in the boarded window. Milo slept. His breaths deepened. His ears twitched every so often, half alert, half home. And Emily? She didn't sleep. She stared. And listened. And let herself feel everything she'd buried for 4 winters straight. In the morning, the sun broke through the gray. Emily stepped outside to gather snow for melting and froze. There were paw prints in the snow. But not just Milo's. Other tracks. Smaller. Some trailing from the woods. Others circling the back of the cabin. She crouched, tracing one with her mittened hand. Bear. Definitely. But younger. Cubs? Her heart jumped. Milo had been alone when he left. But bears, they don't travel in groups. Not like that. Not unless. She turned sharply. Inside, Milo was still asleep. But he wasn't alone anymore, was he? Not if those tracks meant what she thought. Not if Milo had come back not just to see her, but to show her something. Emily stood frozen on the threshold, her breath catching in her chest. The tracks in the snow weren't from a single bear. There were at least 3 distinct sizes. One nearly the size of Milo's, possibly another adult. The others much smaller. Uneven. Wandering. Meandering. Like children following a parent. She knelt by the nearest one, brushing snow from the indentation. Fresh. Just hours old. And not deep enough for Milo. She whispered aloud, not even sure why, "You didn't come alone." Her mind reeled. Had he become a father? Adopted orphaned cubs? Or was he simply guiding lost ones the way she once guided him? She stood slowly, scanning the tree line again. Nothing. But she could feel it. The woods weren't empty. Inside the cabin, Milo stirred. The wooden floor creaked under his shifting weight as he rose to his haunches. He didn't seem startled, just alert. Like he already knew who had been nearby. Like he had brought them. Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Her voice was quiet. "Milo, who did you bring with you?" He looked at her, directly, purposefully. His eyes steady, his ears tilted forward. Then he turned toward the door and let out a single, low grunt. Not aggressive. Not a warning. A signal. Seconds later, Emily heard it, a rustle in the snow. Then another. Soft thuds. Pauses. Breaths. And then, a snout peeked from behind the porch rail. It was smaller than Milo by far. No more than knee height, with thick dark fur and wide, curious eyes. The cub blinked, sniffed the doorframe, and took one hesitant step forward. Emily didn't move. Another followed. And another. 3 cubs in total. Each different in size and build, possibly different mothers. Yet somehow, all with him. Milo didn't approach them. He just sat quietly, like a silent chaperone, letting them explore. Letting them choose whether to trust. Emily stepped aside from the door. The first cub stepped in. It paused just past the threshold, sniffing the air, patting the wooden floor with unsure paws. The second followed, nearly stumbling over the first. The third, more cautious, lingered on the porch but eventually came in. Once all 3 had entered, Milo lay back down, this time in the corner opposite the hearth, giving them space. Emily sat down slowly, crossing her legs. She watched the cubs sniff her boots, then the scarf, then circle back toward Milo. Each took their place around him, one leaning against his flank, one curled near his back paws, and one lying half across his chest. Her throat tightened. He hadn't just returned. He had brought them home. The day passed quietly. Emily fed herself slowly from a sealed pouch of jerky and a protein bar she'd stuffed in her backpack days before. She didn't try to feed the bears. Not yet. If they were surviving with Milo, they likely still foraged on their own. She watched as they slept, nuzzled into one another, Milo breathing calm and deep. Then she turned to the corner of the room where an old cedar chest still sat, cracked but intact. Inside were photos. Old notebooks. Drawings she'd done in the first winter when Milo was a cub and she was still clinging to the idea of a future here. She pulled one sheet out, a hand-drawn sketch of a baby bear paw beside her own. She laughed softly under her breath. So much had changed. And yet, she turned to look at the cubs. The middle one, the boldest, had started pawing gently at her scarf. She reached out slowly, laying it flat, and the cub nestled its chin onto it like it belonged to him. Just like Milo used to. Her eyes welled. She had come here hoping for closure. Instead, she was being asked to begin again. That night, the wind howled harder than before. Snow blew sideways against the windows, creeping in through gaps and seams. The fire pit remained cold, but the room felt warm with breath and presence. Emily didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the wall, notebook open, pen in hand. She began to write. I don't know where you were all these years, Milo. But you never forgot. And somehow, neither did I. At some point near dawn, Milo rose and approached her. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't nudge or touch her. Instead, he turned, looked toward the door, and grunted softly. A call. A suggestion. Emily stood, stiff from the floor. She opened the door. And together, they stepped outside. The snow had stopped. The storm had passed. And in the glow of a pale orange sunrise, she saw it, a small path. Cubs' pawprints, scattered but deliberate, tracing a route toward the trees. Not random wandering. A trail. She looked down at Milo. He stared up the trail. Then back at her. And she understood. He hadn't just come home. He was showing her something. There was more to this journey. And he wanted her to follow. Emily stood at the threshold of the cabin, staring into the trees. The world beyond was quiet, not the hollow silence of loss, but the expectant stillness of something about to begin. The trail before her, freshly marked by tiny paws, led into the pines like a hand extended. Milo stood beside her, his breath rising in soft clouds. The cubs tumbled out one by one behind him, yawning, bumping into one another like half-asleep toddlers. But they didn't hesitate. As Milo began to walk toward the woods, they followed without question. Emily stepped into her boots, pulled her scarf tighter, and grabbed the old canvas pack from the hook. She didn't know what she was walking toward, but she knew she had to go. They moved together, one woman, one bear, 3 cubs, into the early morning light. The forest had changed in the years since she'd last truly walked it. Some trees had fallen, splitting old paths. Others had grown taller, thicker, hiding once familiar landmarks. The snow muffled every step, and yet the cubs danced ahead like they'd done it 100 times before. Milo didn't rush. He moved with confidence but never far from Emily's side. Every so often, he'd stop, sniff the air, and grunt low, a kind of check-in. She found herself responding in whispers, as if words might disturb something sacred. After nearly an hour of quiet travel, the trees began to thin. The terrain rose slightly, not a full hill, but a ridge. Beyond it, the treetops fell away. And then Emily saw it. A clearing. It wasn't natural. The snow was disturbed in precise patterns, a ring where ground had been cleared intentionally, brush piled in one corner, logs dragged into rough perimeters. At first glance, it looked like the remnants of a hunting camp or temporary shelter. But as she stepped closer, she realized it wasn't for humans. There were claw marks on some of the trees, high and deliberate. Bits of fur caught in low branches. Flattened patches in the snow where large bodies had slept. A circle of pressed earth where, long before the snow returned, something had dug deeply and then filled it again. A den. Not one built by instinct. One arranged by memory. Emily turned toward Milo. He was standing by the largest tree at the edge of the clearing. Its trunk was scarred, a long diagonal slash about 4 feet off the ground. The same mark she had used to track him years ago, when he would wander too far and she'd leave signals on trees for him to find his way back. He remembered. He had marked it again. Her knees weakened beneath her, and she lowered herself into the snow. The cubs were already racing through the clearing, chasing each other, pawing the fresh snow, one even attempting to climb a log before tumbling backward. Milo didn't move. He simply watched them. Then, with a low huff, he sat, his gaze never leaving the ring. Emily scanned the space again, this time more carefully. Tucked beneath one of the low boughs, hidden by snow and bramble, was a wooden tag, no bigger than her hand, dark with age, strung with twine. She crawled toward it, brushing the snow away. Her breath caught. The tag was hers. She had carved it during the second spring, a small wood token with M for Milo, and hung it near the cabin on a birch tree before his release. But the birch tree had fallen long ago. This meant he had come back. Years ago. Without her knowing. He had taken the tag. And brought it here. She sat back, overwhelmed. Her eyes stung, but the tears didn't fall. Not yet. The cubs padded over and collapsed beside her, one resting its head on her boot, another curling under her arm. She didn't push them away. They smelled like pine and musk and something older. But beneath it, there was that same softness she remembered from Milo's early days. The same tiny huffs, the same weightless sighs as they drifted to sleep. Milo approached slowly, dropping to his belly beside her. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without warning, he rested his head in her lap. She couldn't hold it in. Her fingers trembled as she placed them gently between his ears, just as she had done countless times before. "You came back," she whispered, voice cracking. Milo didn't respond, but she felt the rumble in his chest, a low, grounding sound, not fear, not warning, just presence. Later that afternoon, as the sky dimmed to soft gray, Emily took out her notebook again. She wrote, "This place, it's not where he hid. It's where he built something. Where he waited. Where he remembered." She looked at the tag again, now hanging from a fresh branch she'd propped up by the den. And added, "I thought I taught him how to survive. But maybe he was showing me how to come back." They didn't return to the cabin that night. Emily cleared a space under the sheltering pines and laid her blanket down beside the cubs. Milo remained near the entrance of the den, standing guard like an old sentinel. Not wild. Not tame. Something else. Something in between. As the stars emerged above the treetops, Emily let her hand rest beside his paw. And just before her eyes closed, she felt it. The warmth of fur. The steady breath of trust. And the silent promise of everything he couldn't say, but had shown her instead. Morning came slow and silver. Emily opened her eyes to the soft crunch of snow falling from branches above. The forest around them was blanketed in white silence, interrupted only by the subtle rise and fall of the cubs' breathing and the distant call of a jaybird. Milo was already awake. He stood near the edge of the clearing, watching the tree lean, posture calm but vigilant. He hadn't strayed all night. Hadn't chased, hunted, or wandered. He had stood watch, as if this patch of snow, this hidden den, was something sacred. Emily sat up, brushing snow from her sleeves. Her back ached from the cold, but her heart was still. She glanced at the cubs, all huddled against each other in a pile like a living knot of warmth. Then she looked again at the den. It was deeper than she'd noticed before. Wider too, a real shelter, not just a hollow. And built with purpose. Inside, she now saw a layering of fur, likely shed coats, and even stones arranged around the inner wall. They hadn't just been placed for comfort. They marked something. A boundary. A memory. She stepped closer and peered inside. There, just beyond the reach of light, was something darker than fur or dirt. A shape. She hesitated, then knelt and reached into her backpack for the small flashlight she kept clipped to the side. She flicked it on. The beam lit up the far wall of the den, and what she saw drew the breath from her chest. Bones. Small ones. Clean. Arranged. And beside them, a strip of blue fabric. Torn. Faded. She recognized it instantly. It was from the shirt she had worn the day Milo was released. A long-sleeved thermal, frayed at the cuffs. She'd torn the sleeve climbing back through the pines that evening. She never found the piece. She had assumed it had caught on a branch and blown off in the wind. But here it was. He had taken it. And he had left it here. With the bones. Emily backed out of the den slowly, careful not to disturb anything. She stood in the clearing, shaking slightly, her breath visible in the chill. Milo didn't look at her. He remained by the trees, still, watching. But she understood now. The bones weren't from prey. They were from another cub. Maybe one he had cared for. Protected. Maybe even tried to save. The den wasn't just a shelter. It was a grave. A memory of a bond lost. Marked by fabric, her fabric, the only connection Milo had to both that cub and her. She pressed her hand against her mouth. How long had he lived with that grief? Alone? Without language, without explanation? How long had he returned to that place before finally finding her again? And now, he had brought her here. To witness it. To share it. That afternoon, Emily built a small fire just outside the clearing. Not for warmth, but for ritual. She hadn't lit a fire since leaving the cabin years ago. But now, she dug a shallow pit, lined it with stones, and gathered dry kindling with hands that trembled with memory. Milo didn't approach. He lay in the snow, watching. When the flame finally sparked to life, she reached into her pack and pulled out an old tin box, one she had kept buried at the bottom for years. Inside were photos. One of them was Milo as a cub, curled on the porch beside her worn boots. Another was the day she'd found him, barely alive, bleeding, eyes sealed shut. She placed both photos beside the fire. Then, slowly, she tore the edges, one by one, and fed them into the flame. Not to destroy the memories, but to release them. She spoke aloud, not expecting the bear to understand, but needing to say the words just the same. I wasn't ready back then. Not for you to leave. Not for you to come back either. The fire crackled. But I think, maybe you were never trying to come back. She looked toward the den. You were trying to bring someone with you. As the fire faded, the cubs wandered closer, curiosity drawing them toward the glowing embers. Emily didn't stop them. She sat quietly, arms wrapped around her knees, watching them sniff the scorched wood. They had no idea what it meant. But they stayed close. Even Milo stepped near as the last bits of smoke rose into the cold. He brushed against her shoulder. A quiet wait. That night, Emily unrolled the last piece of parchment in her notebook and drew. No photos. Just charcoal lines and memory. She sketched the clearing. The den. The cubs curled around Milo's side. And then, her own silhouette, seated beside the fire. Above it all, she wrote a single line. We all carry grief. But some of us carry it home. The wind picked up after dark. Emily lay beside the cubs, the warmth of their small bodies pressed into her coat. She looked up at the stars blinking through the tree canopy. Then slowly, she turned her head and found Milo already watching her. He blinked once. Heavy. Slow. Knowing. And this time, he inched closer. Laid his paw gently across her boot. And closed his eyes. The following morning broke with brittle light and a stillness that wasn't peaceful, it was personal. Emily sat awake before the sun breached the trees, watching the embers from last night's fire fade to a dull red beneath a fresh sprinkle of snow. The cubs were asleep in a tangled knot. Milo sat upright a short distance away, staring at nothing. Or maybe staring at everything. She hadn't spoken since last night's fire. Not because she didn't want to, but because something inside her had stirred. Something she wasn't ready to confront. Until now. She stood up slowly, brushing frost from her sleeves, and stepped toward the den again. Not inside. Just near enough to feel its presence. She crouched beside the entrance. The bones. The cloth. The story Milo had brought her to see. It wasn't just his. She closed her eyes. Let her knees sink into the snow. And then, like peeling back old skin, it came. Not the way she remembered it all these years. But the way she had hidden it. For winters ago, the night Milo had walked into the trees, she'd waited long after the sun fell. She told herself it was just to make sure he had gone far enough. That she wasn't just sitting there, hoping he'd turn around. But that night, there had been a sound. A sharp cry. And a second shadow near the tree line. She hadn't gone after it. She hadn't moved. She'd been too afraid that if she did, he'd see her and turn back. And that would mean she failed. She had chosen to trust the program. Trust the plan. Let him go. But days later, when the biologists tagged the bear, the one she believed was Milo, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. That the cry in the woods that night hadn't been from him. She convinced herself she imagined it. But now, with the bones in the den, with Milo bringing her here, she knew. There had been another cub. Maybe one that had followed him. Or that he had found after. Maybe even one she could have saved if she had moved. If she had gone into the woods. Instead, she stayed. Let the cry fade into the pines. And closed the door. Tears fell before she realized she was crying. Not just because of what happened. But because of how long she'd kept that memory quiet. How long she had buried it beneath her role as a professional. A rehabilitator. Someone who could explain the wild in controlled terms. But grief doesn't follow protocols. And love, real, wordless, wild love, doesn't fit inside guidelines. Behind her, the snow crunched. She turned to see Milo watching her from a distance. He hadn't come closer. He didn't need to. He knew. And that was enough. She didn't speak. But she bowed her head toward him, slow, deliberate, respectful. Then she stood. Walked past the fire pit. Past the cubs. And into the trees. The forest deepened quickly. Emily didn't have a map, but her feet knew the way. Years ago, she'd walked this path nearly every day. Before the world got too heavy. Before she left everything behind. Now, the trail had changed, overgrown in places, blanketed by drifts, but she followed it like muscle memory. After nearly 20 minutes of weaving through pine and frost, she found it. A small stream. Frozen over now. But she recognized the twisted birch hanging over it, once struck by lightning in a summer storm. She stepped to its base. And waited. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. And then, she heard it. Snow shifting. Brush moving. She turned. Milo was there. Alone. No cubs. He moved slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside her. Close enough that she could feel his warmth, hear the sound of his breath. Emily knelt. Reached into her coat pocket. And pulled out the blue tag. The one from the den. He watched her. She pressed it into the snow beside the birch, anchoring it with a small rock. No big ceremony. No fire. Just a mark. A place. And then she whispered, more to herself than to him. I should have come that night. Milo sat down beside her. For the first time, she realized, not just how big he had become, but how still he was. Not frozen. Not afraid. Just still. Like someone who'd already made peace. Like someone who had waited until she was ready to do the same. They sat like that for hours. And when Emily finally stood, she didn't feel guilt. She felt presence. She touched Milo's shoulder, fingers brushing across the scar, the same way she had the first night she found him hurt and bleeding. And then they walked back to the clearing together. No hurry. No trail. Just silence, and breath, and cold, and life. Back in the clearing, the cubs were curled near the fire pit again. One lifted its head at the sound of their return, then dropped it back onto its sibling. Emily dropped her pack by the fire and knelt beside them. They shifted, pawed lazily at her coat. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like she belonged. Later that night, she took her notebook out again. This time, she didn't write. She tore a page out. One from the very first entry. She rolled it up, tucked it into a small carved notch in the den wall, just beside the stones. And left it there. No signature. No title. Just words. Sometimes the ones we lose are the ones who teach us how to come back. The next 2 days passed like slow breaths. Emily stayed in the clearing, sleeping near the cubs, waking to the rhythm of the forest rather than a clock. She boiled snow for water, ate in small bites, and wrote only a little. Words, she found, were suddenly fragile things. What mattered was not what she said, but that she was there. Milo remained close, but not hovering. He would vanish into the trees for an hour or two and return silently, always pausing at the tree line before stepping into the ring of pawprints that had become their temporary home. The cubs grew more playful, more trusting. One of them had taken to nipping at her bootlaces and scampering behind her whenever she moved. Another dragged a strip of bark around like a toy, shaking it with surprising joy. The third was the quiet one, always watching Milo, always choosing sleep beside his massive form rather than chase snowflakes with the others. Emily began to name them in her mind. She didn't say the names aloud, not yet. She knew better than to name what she couldn't keep. On the third morning, Emily woke to find the den empty. No Milo. No cubs. At first, she wasn't afraid. Milo often disappeared for short periods, but never with the cubs. And never without sound. She waited an hour. Then 2. Then the silence turned sharp. She rose and began walking, retracing every step of the past days. Into the pines. Past the stream. Toward the ridgeline. Listening. Watching. Calling only once, quietly, Milo. Nothing. Then, just before the sun reached its peak, she heard it. A rustle. A soft, pained cry. She followed it through a patch of deadfall and found them. All 3 cubs were huddled together at the base of a fallen log. But Milo was not with them. She approached slowly. The cubs didn't run. They didn't play. They didn't even rise. One was limping. The quiet one. Its rear paw was curled unnaturally beneath it, as if injured. The others stayed close, protective, unsure. Emily dropped to her knees. The injury wasn't fresh, but it had worsened. Frostbite, perhaps. Or a sprain. Either way, the cub had grown too weak to keep up. And Milo? Had he gone to find help? Was he nearby, watching? She scanned the trees. Waited. Whispered. But there was no sound. No shadow. Just snow. She tore a strip from the lining of her coat and wrapped the cub's paw gently, fingers numb, breath catching. The cub didn't resist. Not this time. Maybe it remembered the way she sat near the fire. The way she never pushed. Or maybe, like Milo, it just knew something in her heart had changed. She lifted the cub, slowly, carefully, and carried it back to the clearing. The others followed. Still no Milo. By dusk, her worry hardened into certainty. He wasn't coming back. That night, she sat near the fire with the cub curled beside her, its paw bandaged and tucked beneath its chin. The others lay close, eyes blinking in the amber glow. She stared into the trees, her voice barely above breath. "You brought them to me, didn't you?" Her fingers trembled as they traced the spine of her notebook. "You waited until I was ready. Then you brought them. And now?" She swallowed. "You're gone." The fire popped softly. And for the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question she had buried under every moment of reunion and wonder. Had Milo come back to say goodbye? Not to stay. Not to be saved. But to leave something behind. To leave them. To leave a part of himself that she could carry. And perhaps, to finally rest. She looked around the clearing, at the den he had dug, the scarf he had claimed, the path he had shown her. It wasn't a random return. It was a handoff. He had raised them. Protected them. And when the smallest could no longer walk, he brought them to her. Not because he didn't love them. But because he trusted her more than himself. That night, Emily didn't write. She didn't speak. She simply laid her hand flat in the snow, palm open. And waited. In the morning, the cubs woke slowly. The limping one tried to stand. Struggled. Fell. She helped it up gently, whispering encouragements like muscle memory. She rose and walked to the edge of the clearing. Scanned the ridge. The trees. The slope toward the birch. Still no sign. Still nothing. But she knew now. He wasn't coming back. Not because he was lost. Not because he didn't care. but because, like her, he had been carrying something too long. And he had finally laid it down. She sat with the cubs that afternoon and watched them sleep. The forest moved gently around them, wind, snow, and quiet. And then she whispered the names aloud. One by one. To no one. To everyone. That evening, she gathered branches. Not for fire. But for shelter. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. They needed time. And she had finally found her place again. Not as a researcher. Not as a rescuer. But as a witness. And maybe, just maybe, as family. The snow fell steadily for the next 3 days. Not the harsh, blinding kind, but soft, steady, curtain-like. It wrapped the trees in white shawls and buried the edges of the clearing in silence. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, as if the forest had taken a breath and let it go. Emily didn't leave. She built a lean-to near the den using fallen branches and the tarp from her pack. Each morning, she boiled water over a small flame and melted snow in her palms to clean the limping cub's wound. The other two, increasingly curious and restless, roamed the clearing but never strayed far. They had accepted her. Or maybe they had always been waiting for her to. By the 4th morning, the injured cub tried to stand on its own. It wobbled, stumbled, let out a pitiful grunt, and then stood. Not for long. But it was something. Emily couldn't help the laugh that escaped her chest. Not loud. Just a whisper of joy she hadn't felt in a very long time. She spent her afternoons rebuilding the den's entrance, reinforcing the sides with fresh pine boughs and digging out some of the snow-packed floor. The cubs watched her work, occasionally helping in clumsy ways, dragging sticks, biting the ends, knocking them out of place again. She let them. The process wasn't about precision. It was about presence. Inside the den, she laid down a new cloth, a spare flannel from her pack, softened from years of folding. She tucked it near the back, beside the bones. She didn't remove them. She simply made space around them. Not to forget, but to honor. Milo's den had become theirs now. And hers too. At night, she wrapped herself in the old blanket, cubs nestled close, and looked at the place where Milo had once slept. It remained untouched. Snow had dusted the spot. The outline faded day by day. But she didn't clear it. She wanted to remember. Even in absence, he was still there. She thought about leaving. More than once. She had a phone, buried deep in her backpack, powered off to conserve battery. She could hike back to the trailhead. Find help. Bring the cubs to a sanctuary or a reserve. But every time she looked at them, playing, sleeping, nudging each other's faces, she felt a quiet pull that told her to stay a little longer. Not because they needed her, but because she needed them. On the 6th day, a pair of birds landed on the edge of the clearing. They chirped, hopped, peered curiously at the cubs. The cubs didn't chase them. Emily sat near the fire and smiled. Life had started to return. Not just to the clearing, but to her. That afternoon, she opened her notebook for the first time in days. The page was blank. She stared at it for a long time. Then, with a breath, she wrote, "I came here carrying the weight of what I lost. But now I understand, what matters is what remains." She closed the book. And didn't need to write anything else. Later that evening, while the cubs slept, she found herself walking to the old trail near the ridge, the one that disappeared into the thickest trees. It had always been the edge of her map. The place she stopped. The place Milo had once vanished beyond. Now, she stood at the threshold again. Snow fell gently on her hood. And for a moment, just one, she let herself believe he might appear. Might step from the shadows, just once more. But no sound came. And still, she smiled. Because she knew now, he didn't have to return to stay. He never truly left. When she walked back to camp, she paused at the tree where she'd tied the scarf. It fluttered slightly in the wind, one end buried in frost, the other curled like a wave. She reached up, untied it, folded it gently, and placed it inside the den, near the cloth, beside the bones. A gift returned. A chapter closed. That night, the cubs curled against her chest. Their breaths slow and even. The stars blinked above, visible through a gap in the canopy, where the sky opened like a wound that had finally healed. Emily whispered into the dark. "I'm not afraid to be found anymore. And let sleep take her." The sky turned pale with the first signs of dawn, and the cold carried less bite than before. Emily stirred beneath the blanket, shifting carefully to avoid waking the cubs pressed close to her side. Their soft breaths puffed in rhythm, tiny clouds rising with every exhale. For a long moment, she didn't move. She simply watched them. Each fur pattern memorized. Each curve of paw and flick of ear etched into her mind like a vow. They were more than animals now. They were echoes of Milo, of her own grief, and of the part of her that had once gone quiet. But something had changed in her. Not just comfort. Readiness. She sat up slowly, letting the blanket slide to her lap. Today was the day. She stepped away from the clearing, following the ridge trail once more. No backpack. No gear. Just herself and a small, folded piece of paper in her coat. The route she took led beyond the path Milo had shown her, curling to the west, toward the trailhead that connected, eventually, to the outside world. She hadn't walked this way in years. Not since the day she left everything. 2 hours later, the forest began to thin. And then, rising out of the white ahead, she saw the shape of the old ranger's shed, half collapsed, roof caved in, but still visible against the trees. Near it stood the rusted signpost that once marked the wildlife boundary. She paused beside it. Snow had gathered around the base, burying the lettering. But she knew what it said. Ridgepoint Forest Preserve, authorized access only. Funny how long she had lived outside that permission. She reached into her coat and pulled out the paper she had written last night, just a few short lines, torn from her notebook. She tucked it under the weathered metal frame. Not a goodbye. Not this time. An invitation. I found something here. Or maybe it found me. They are safe. But they won't be forever. If you come, come quietly. Come kindly. And only if you're ready to believe what grief can grow. She stared at the words for a moment, then stepped away. The cubs would wake soon. They would need her. And she didn't know how much longer they had, together, before the pull of the wild called them forward, away from the clearing. Or worse, before someone else came. Someone who wouldn't understand. Back at the den, the cubs greeted her with muffled cries and curious paws. The limping one was walking now, slowly, carefully, but strong. The other two pounced gently around it, careful in ways that surprised her. They were becoming a unit. Not just a memory. A future. She sat beside them that evening, feeding each a handful of dried berries she had soaked in melted snow. Their eyes watched her with unspoken understanding. Not gratitude. Bears don't express thanks the way humans do. But presence. Trust. The things that mattered. As the sky faded to a bruised lavender, she walked once more to the fire pit, rekindled it, and stared into the flames. The question she'd avoided now returned, quiet but clear. Will you leave them? Or will you stay? Her answer didn't come in words. It came in movement. She reached for her notebook, tore out the final page, and tossed it into the fire. Not to destroy it. To release it. She had written enough. Now, she would live it. That night, long after the fire died and the snow began again, she dreamed of him. Not of his last moment, but of the first. The day she found him, cold and near death, nestled against his mother's side. The way he had opened his eyes for the first time, not in fear, but in stillness. The same way he'd looked at her the night he returned. A full circle. Not a perfect one, but true. She woke before dawn, the cubs still tucked beside her. Snow covered the world like a blank page. And for the first time, she didn't want to write anything on it. Not yet. Some things, she realized, are better carried in silence. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in gently, in the drip of melting icicles from pine branches, in the thin sheen of water atop packed snow, in the shifting birdsong that started low and curious and grew louder each day. Emily stayed. Not out of indecision, but out of understanding. The cubs weren't ready to leave. And neither was she. Weeks passed like slow turning pages. She built stronger walls for the lean-to, reinforced the den with salvaged bark. She marked the trees with quiet signals, not for herself, but for anyone who might find their way here and need to know they were not alone. And each day, the cubs grew bolder. The limping one no longer limped. The quiet one climbed trees. The wildest one brought her rocks, sticks, once even a beetle, dropped proudly at her feet like a gift. She named them again, this time aloud. And they didn't flinch. On the first night the snow didn't fall, she sat near the fire and looked up through the pines. The sky was clear. Stars sharp. She spoke into the air, not expecting an answer, but needing to say it anyway. I'll let them go. Her voice cracked. I'll let them go when they're ready. 2 days later, the first one left. It was early, the frost still hard on the ground, when she woke to find the playful cub gone. No sign of struggle. No blood. No fear. Just the absence of footprints in the snow leading out of the clearing. A direction. A decision. She didn't cry. Not this time. The second went a week later. The quiet one. It lingered for hours at the edge of the clearing that morning, looking back again and again. Not lost. Not afraid. Just remembering. And then it vanished into the green. That left the smallest. The one she had carried. The one who still pressed into her side at night, even now as spring thinned the cold. Emily watched it carefully. She knew the time would come. And she feared it more than the others. Because in this one, she saw herself. One morning, she awoke to find it still lying beside her. But its head was lifted. Ears tilted. Listening to something she couldn't hear. It rose, stepped to the trail, the very one Milo had once taken, and paused. Waited. She held her breath. And then, slowly, she rose too. Walked to its side. The cub turned its head slightly toward her, nose twitching. She knelt. Pressed her forehead gently to its fur. I'll be okay. The words were hers. But they belonged to both of them. The cub blinked slowly, then turned and walked into the trees. She watched until she couldn't see it anymore. Waited until the wind no longer carried its scent. And then she returned to the clearing. Alone. The den was empty now. Just pine needles. Ash. Her scarf, tucked deep in a corner. She didn't touch it. She sat outside the entrance and let the silence surround her. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't hollow. It was full of everything they had shared. Of everything they had healed. Later that day, she gathered her things. Not all of them. Some she left behind, her blanket, the flannel inside the den, the tin cup resting on the firestone. Pieces of herself. Markers for anyone, human or otherwise, who might come next. At the trailhead, she paused. The same rusted signpost stood there, and beneath it, her folded note remained, weather-worn but intact. She didn't write a new one. She just placed a rock beside it. Then stepped forward. She walked for miles. And when she reached the edge of the forest and the sound of the road beyond, she stopped and turned back. The trees swayed. Birds called. And in the stillness, in the hush between breeze and breath, she heard it. A soft, steady exhale. Like a bear, laying down beside her one last time. She smiled. And whispered to the wind. You came back, and so did I. She stepped into the light. And did not look back again.